Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello. Where are my captions? There they are. They were just a little bit slow coming on. All right, so we are on part 3 of Revan. We're actually on chapter 4, and probably I'll read 4 and 5 tonight. Depends on how I feel at the end of 4. 5 is fairly short, but 4 is a little bit longer. So anyway, we'll get right on into it. So sit back and enjoy. Chapter 4. Located in a remote system far from any major hyperspace lanes, Halion was a small and insignificant planet among the dozens of worlds dominated by the Sith Empire. Its only remarkable features were the 7 small natural satellites that orbited the world, just barely large enough to be considered moons. On this evening, 4 of them were waxing full, their combined glow illuminating the darkness enough for Scourge to clearly make out the details of the Uxiol droid manufacturing plant's exterior even without his night goggles. "Your blueprints didn't show a security fence," he whispered. He and Cecil were huddled in a small copse of trees on the edge of a field roughly 20 meters from the plant. "Maybe it's new," Cecil replied, also speaking softly. "Shouldn't be a problem, though. Once you're on the other side, you can just open the gate and let me in." Scourge had noticed a remarkable change in Cecil during the mission. The sniveling bootlick that had greeted him at the spaceport on Droman Kaas was gone, replaced by someone who was intelligent and self-confident. Obviously, the personality he had displayed on their first meeting had been a ruse, a cover he used to hide his true nature from outsiders. He was still probably useless in an actual fight, but Scourge was beginning to understand how he had risen to such a prominent position in Nyrus's household. He had compensated for his lack of the Force by developing his mental skills, and apparently Cecil had enjoyed a very successful career with Imperial intelligence before becoming Nyrus's chief advisor. If they've got autoguns on the roof, we'll be dead before we get anywhere near that maintenance store," Scourge growled. "It's a manufacturing plant, not a fortress," Cecil assured him. "Most of their security is electronic. You know, stuff I can slice. The worst you'll have to deal with is a couple of roving security droids." "Patrol drones or assault droids?" "Patrol drones. UDM doesn't manufacture assault droids. Too expensive for a small company like this." After a short pause, Cecil added, "Are you always this skittish on the job?" "Only fools charge ahead without knowing what lies in wait," Scourge answered through gritted teeth. It was more than the other's insolence that grated on him. Cecil's question had struck a nerve. There was something about this job that made Scourge uneasy. Part of it was being forced to work with a partner. Normally he worked alone. Yet there was more to his unease than the presence of the Sith crouched beside him. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, but something felt off. It made him hesitant, more cautious than usual. "You're sure the entrance code will work? It's not going to set off some kind of alarm?" he asked, trying to think of anything that could possibly go wrong. "I can handle a few patrol drones, but if a dozen of them come down on us all at once, we're in trouble." "The code will work," Cecil promised. "This is a simple job." He was right. This was a simple job. Scourge was forced to admit that maybe the problem wasn't the mission. "Taking things for granted is a good way to get yourself killed," Scourge told him as he stood up, trying to justify his behavior even as he struggled to push away the self-doubt creeping through the corners of his mind. He made a final check of his equipment and armor, then slid his night goggles into place. The world took on an eerie green glow as the illumination from the moons above was enhanced tenfold. He drew his lightsaber, but didn't ignite it. According to the blueprints they'd gone over, there weren't supposed to be any cams, but there wasn't supposed to be a fence either. "Meet me at the gate," Scourge said, but not bothering to wait for a reply, he broke from his cover, sprinting toward the 3-meter-high security fence. Building speed with a dozen quick steps, he launched himself into the air, his cape billowing out behind him. He cleared the fence by only a few centimeters, close enough that he could feel a tingle in the soles of his boots from the lethal current coursing through it. At the apex of his leap, he hung suspended in air for just an instant. Then gravity reasserted its hold and he plummeted to the ground. He landed in a 3-point stance, using his free hand to help absorb the impact. He turned his head quickly from side to side, looking to see if there was any reaction to his sudden arrival. Fortunately, his entrance had gone unnoticed. Crouched low to the ground, he ran along the perimeter of the fence, heading to the gate he and Cecil had spotted earlier. As he approached, he noticed a single droid posted as a guard. It was conical in shape, a little more than a meter tall, and half a meter wide at its base. It hovered a meter off the ground, and 3 long, thin legs dangled below it, each ending in a tri-fingered claw. A ring of lights encircled the main body 2/3 of the way up, blinking in some indefinable pattern. Scourge's night vision goggles distorted all colors to varying shades of green, but he could clearly make out the two-tone pattern on the droid's hull, probably gray and orange. Uxial Droid Manufacturing's corporate colors. It was clearly a patrol drone, just as Sechel had promised. Assault droids were much larger, at least twice the size, and were usually designed as two-legged walking units. They were covered in thick plate armor and tended to have heavy blaster cannons mounted on their exterior, neither of which the floating sentry possessed. The patrol drone's sensors were focused on the gate, not on the Sith warrior, bearing down on it from behind. Once he closed to within 10 meters, Scourge ignited his lightsaber and launched it with a quick flick of the wrist. The spinning blade easily sliced through the unreinforced plating of the droid's hull and into its control circuits, sending up a shower of sparks before returning to Scourge's hand. The hovering drone dropped to the ground, its repulsors rendered non-functional. 2 of its 3 legs were pinned beneath the conical body. The third jutted out at a strange angle, mangled by the fall. The row of blinking lights flashed erratically, internal sensors overwhelmed by the catastrophic damage. But still the droid managed an awkward spin that brought it face to face with the intruder. A panel on its hull slid open, and Scourge could just make out the circular tip of a small internal blaster taking aim as he closed in for the final blow. The drone fired, but its targeting systems were no longer operational, and the bolt flew high and wide. Scourge was on it before it had a chance to try again. His boot delivered a heavy kick, toppling the droid helplessly onto its side. 2 quick chops from the lightsaber finished the job, and the row of flickering lights went dark. Scourge was breathing hard from the exertion. Defeating a droid never gave him the same rush as killing the flesh-and-blood foe. But he could still feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, washing away his earlier unease about the mission. With the sentry dispatched, he was able to focus on the control panel beside the gate, though he kept his lightsaber drawn and ready just in case. Fortunately, it was a standard layout, and he was able to cut the power to the fence and open the gate with a few simple button pushes. Sechel was already waiting for him on the other side. He glanced down at the disabled patrol drone as he passed through the gate and gave Scourge a look that seemed to say, "I told you so." Scourge ignored him and headed for the maintenance door. Sechel scrambled after him. The small maintenance door was made of heavily reinforced durasteel. Scourge doubted even his lightsaber would be able to penetrate it. Hopefully he wouldn't have to try. Sechel stepped up to the security pad beside the door and entered a long series of numbers. Scourge stood watch in case any more patrol drones appeared. After a few tense seconds, there was a soft beep from the security pad, and the door slid open. "See," Sechel said, "no alarms, no assault droids, nothing to worry about." "We're not done yet," Scourge replied, shouldering past him and into the manufacturing plant. They found themselves standing in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. If the blueprints they had were accurate, it would lead them into the plant from the rear, from where they would have to cross the production floor to the records office, where Sechel would slice into the plant's network to find out who had paid UDM to manufacture the custom-built droid that had tried and failed to kill Nyrus. "Stay close," Scourge instructed Sechel as he removed his night vision goggles with his free hand and clipped them to his belt. "If we run into trouble, hide in a corner and try not to get shot." "That's what I do best," Sechel assured him. Scourge set off down the hall, Sechel following a few steps behind. It continued straight for about 30 meters, then made a sharp left turn that terminated in a closed door. Unlike the door that had given them access to the plant, this one didn't appear to be reinforced or locked. From the other side, Scourge could clearly hear the deep, rhythmic thud of heavy machinery churning away. He pressed the access panel on the wall, his muscles instinctively coiling as he dropped into a fighting crouch. The door slid open to reveal the plant's main production floor, and a wave of intense heat smacked him in the face, momentarily taking his breath away. But he relaxed a second later when he realized there was no ambush waiting for them on the other side. The manufacturing floor was massive, at least 100 meters across and easily twice as long. Numerous doors and passages lined each wall, dozens of exits, all leading to different areas of the plant. A network of metal catwalks and stairwells crisscrossed the room. In the center was the source of the intense heat. 4 enormous vats of molten metal, each 10 meters tall and 20 meters in diameter. Half a dozen long conveyor belts extended from the vats to run the entire length of the manufacturing floor, each covered with thousands of individual parts and pieces waiting to be assembled into functional droids. The giant engines powering the belts crashed and churned, drowning out all other sound. Hundreds of bipedal assembly droids lined the conveyor belts, but Scourge knew they didn't present any type of threat. Assembly droids were severely limited in their programming, incapable of performing anything other than the simplest jobs. Unlike the patrol drone he'd dispatched earlier, these would ignore his presence and continue working at their assigned tasks. Apart from the assembly droids, there didn't appear to be anyone around. The plant's flesh and blood supervisors would have left for the night long before. Reaching out with the force, he could sense no other living beings in the vicinity. "Well?" Sechel asked, trying to peer past Scourge's massive frame to get a better view of what lay beyond the door. Even though Sechel was right behind him, it was almost impossible to hear his voice over the conveyor belt's pounding engines. Scourge signaled all clear and stepped through. The records office was located in the southwest corner of the plant, adjacent to the manufacturing floor. They'd have to cross nearly the entire length of the room to get there, and Scourge was perspiring heavily under his armor after only a few seconds. The heat was oppressive. The air almost seemed to stick in his throat. The deafening clang of the engines was relentless. He cast a glance back at his companion. Even though Sechel wasn't wearing armor, he was lagging well behind. Clearly, a life of upper-class luxury had left him thoroughly unprepared for the physical demands of the manufacturing floor's unexpectedly harsh environment. But he struggled gamely onward, wheezing with every labored step. The entrance to the records office turned out to be locked. "Hurry up and get us inside," Scourge shouted. He wanted to get the information and get out. More important at the moment, he knew the office would probably be climate-controlled. Too weary to nod, Sechel leaned against the wall and punched in the security code. The door didn't open. "Try again," Scourge pressed, thinking that in his weakened state Sechel might have hit a wrong key. "Be careful this time." With painstaking precision, Sechel tapped out the code a second time. The roar of the engines drowned out any sound, but Scourge could see the control panel turn red. The words "Access Denied" flashed on the display. Sechel's mouth moved in an inaudible curse, and he tried for a third time, but Scourge already knew it was hopeless. The door required a different code than the one they had used to get past the exterior entrance. Scourge raised his lightsaber and yanked Sechel out of the way. He heard the man shouting, but couldn't make out the words. Gripping the hilt of his lightsaber with both hands, he brought the blade crashing down on the panel, splitting it in two and carving a long, deep furrow in the wall behind it. The door sprang open, and suddenly Scourge's eardrums were nearly shattered by a long, whooping siren. He grabbed Sechel by the collar and tossed him into the room, silently cursing himself for making such a foolish mistake. "Slice into the network and get what you need. I'll hold off security." Sechel didn't waste time with an answer. He began frantically typing at one of the terminals. Scourge could feel the cool air spilling out of the records office and washing over him. He allowed himself a few seconds to bask in the luxury, then turned to face the inevitable enemy onslaught, determined not to make any more missteps. 2 hovering patrol drones, similar to the one he had dispatched earlier, were the first to arrive on the scene. Swooping down to floor level from one of the catwalks near the eastern wall, Scourge charged, moving with the supernatural speed of the Force. The droids opened fire, but Scourge never changed course, relying on his armor to absorb their blaster bolts. One of the bolts narrowly missed his ear. 2 more slammed into his chest. He felt the impact, but it wasn't enough even to knock him off stride. He dropped into a forward somersault as the droids unleashed a second volley, knowing they would be targeting his exposed face and head. The bolts flew harmlessly over him as he tucked, rolled, and then came back up on his feet, finally close enough to retaliate. The patrol drones were not made for close combat. A series of vicious cuts with his lightsaber put a quick end to the encounter. The droids fell to the ground in a shower of sparks, their spindly legs twitching for a few seconds before they shut down completely. Scourge turned his attention to the next two patrol drones. He dispatched the first by hurling his lightsaber at it, knocking it from the air with a single well-placed throw before it even got close enough to use its internally mounted blaster. The second took evasive action, dropping down behind the conveyor belt and a line of assembly droids. It skimmed along the ground, closing the gap until it popped up from behind its cover so it could fire at point-blank range. Scourge made sure it never got the chance. Reaching out to grab the drone with the invisible hand of the Force, he slammed it back down to the ground. Its legs snapped off and went flying. Its exterior hull cracked in multiple places. Several of the welded plates tore loose. All the lights on the body went dim. The alarm sirens were still howling. It wouldn't be long before security droids stationed in other sections of the plant showed up. If the droids kept arriving in small groups of 2 or even 3, Scourge knew he could hold off several more waves at least. If they arrived in greater numbers, he was going to have a problem. He was breathing heavily, the sweat so thick on his red skin he felt as if he had been swimming in the ocean. The Force had sustained him so far, protecting him from the worst of the heat and allowing him to move faster than his enemies could react, but he could draw on it for only so long before exhaustion set in. Already he could feel himself tiring. Cecil had to locate the information soon, or they'd have to retreat empty-handed. He saw the 3 patrol drones enter from one of the passages at the north end of the manufacturing plant. 2 more were moving in from the east. Grimacing, Scourge tightened his grip on the lightsaber and prepared to do battle yet again. Instead of closing in on him, however, the droids kept their distance. The reason for their puzzling behavior became clear a moment later when a massive assault droid lumbered into view. Like the patrol drones, it had the gray and orange finish common to the UDM models, but that was where the similarities ended. 3 meters tall and covered in thick armor plating, the security droid walked on a pair of hinged metal legs, each as thick around as Scourge's waist. Its armless body was thick and wide, 2 meters on every side, topped by a pair of heavy blaster cannons instead of a head. The droid broke into a run toward him, moving fast despite its bulk. At the same time, it opened fire with both cannons. Scourge leapt for cover behind the nearest conveyor belt, unwilling to trust his armor against such overwhelming firepower. The security droid didn't let up. The bolts ripped into the conveyor belt, and the hapless assembly droids lined up along it. Crouched low, Scourge ran back toward the nearby stairwell leading up to the narrow catwalks that ran above the manufacturing floor. A shower of twisted, scorched metal rained down on his back, bits and pieces of those assembly droids unfortunate enough to get in the way of the cannon fire. From the corner of his eye, he saw the patrol drones swooping in to join the fray. Because of the engines and sirens, he couldn't hear the assault droid coming after him, but he could feel its heavy footsteps vibrating the floor. Reaching the stairwell, he took the steps 3 at a time. The assault droid continued to fire, but it wasn't designed to take out aerial targets. Its bulky armor plating limited its vertical range of motion, and from the floor it couldn't get the proper angle for a clear shot toward the ceiling. Its bolts ricocheted off the reinforced metal of the catwalk's safety rails and floor, but none even came close to its intended target. Scourge's elevated position on the catwalk didn't help against the patrol drones, however. Their repulsors allowed them to rise up to the level of the catwalks with ease. With the 5 hovering patrol drones closing in on him, Scourge raced towards the vats of molten metal in the center of the room. The catwalk he was on passed right beside the nearest vat. As he drew closer, the heat became almost unbearable. He felt his skin blistering, but he ignored the pain and continued onward. The drones were rapidly closing in. Two of them swooped in from the side, trying to cut him off. Their path took them directly over the vat, and Scourge seized the opportunity. Drawing on his rapidly dwindling reserves, he used the force to knock one of the drones off course, sending it careening sideways into its partner. The mid-air collision wasn't hard enough to inflict any direct damage, but it caused both to spin out of control. Unable to right themselves in time, they tumbled down into the vat, where the bubbling molten metal closed over them. The three remaining patrol drones altered their course to steer clear of the vats, confirming Scourge's fear that the trick would only work once. They opened fire, but their target suddenly reversed his direction to race back along the catwalk toward the assault droid on the floor below. One of the bolts struck Scourge squarely between the shoulder blades, but luckily it didn't penetrate his armor. The assault droid continued to fire ineffectually at Scourge from below as he charged at it. He closed the gap until he was directly above it, then grabbed the catwalk safety rail and vaulted over the side. He landed directly on the square, flat top of the assault droid and chopped down with his lightsaber. The blade bit deep into the droid's armor plating, but failed to reach any of the internal circuitry. The droid shook angrily from side to side, and Scourge was thrown off. Rolling to absorb the landing, he scrambled to his feet and circled behind the droid. He knew his only chance was to stay on its blind side, so it wouldn't be able to bring its blaster cannons to bear. He slashed at the armor-plated body twice more. The first blow left a scorched furrow. The second, delivered in precisely the same location, went all the way through. The assault droid reacted with a shudder, momentarily listing to one side. But before Scourge could follow up with another attack, it kicked out with one of its massive legs, catching him in the chest and sending him crashing to the ground. A sharp pain shot up from his side, and he knew at least one of his ribs had been cracked. The assault droid was slowly, jerkily turning to face him. The three remaining patrol drones were once again bearing down on him, close enough to open fire. Scourge scrambled forward on his hands and knees. The assault droid was tall enough for him to crawl under its legs and take shelter beneath its body. The blaster bolts from the patrol drones ricocheted ineffectually off the larger droid's armor plating. The assault droid returned fire, its programming instinctively identifying anyone firing at it as a hostile threat. Its blaster cannons tore through the patrol drones, reducing all three to scrap. At the same time, Scourge drove his lightsaber up into the assault droid from below. To save costs and improve mobility, the underside of the droid wasn't equipped with the heavy armor plating that protected the rest of its exterior, and the blade went deep. Scourge stabbed the vulnerable underbelly twice more before rolling clear and springing back to his feet. Staggering, the droid tried to turn and face him. It was leaking thick black lubricant from where Scourge had sliced it open, the liquid forming a rapidly spreading pool beneath its feet. A muffled explosion came from somewhere inside the droid, and a wisp of smoke curled out. Its legs sagged, and it slowly toppled forward, then lay still. Scourge didn't have time to savor his victory. A swarm of patrol drones poured into the room, emerging alone or in pairs from passages on both the north and south walls. At the same time, two more assault droids marched into view, and the Sith Lord's spirit sank. There was no shame in fleeing a battle that couldn't be won. Only a fool continued to fight against impossible odds. Yet, even if he were willing to risk Nyrus's wrath by abandoning Seshel, Scourge doubted escape would be possible. There were too many droids, and he was nearing the point of total exhaustion. With a grim smile, he raised his lightsaber, prepared to inflict as much damage as possible before he died, and then suddenly everything went dark. Scourge fumbled for his night goggles, knowing the illumination from his lightsaber wouldn't be enough to fight by. He yanked them from his belt and slid them into place, then stood stock still, stunned by what he was seeing. None of the droids had taken the opportunity to advance on him. The assault droids hadn't moved. The patrol drones had all fallen to the ground. Only then did he register the fact it wasn't just dark, it was silent. The deafening engines had ground to a halt. The conveyor belts were quiet, and even the assembly droids seemed to be frozen in place. He punched the comm link on his wrist. Seshel, are you there? You're still alive? Seshel asked. He sounded surprised, but before Scourge could ponder that, he swiftly added, Good, I was afraid you wouldn't make it. What just happened? I copied the files I needed from the records office, then I sliced into the power grid and used the emergency override to shut everything down. Figured you could use the help. I could have handled it if it wasn't for the assault droids, Scourge said, making no effort to hide the accusation. Assault droids? Really? Must be a new prototype UDM is working on. Where are you now? Scourge asked. Still near the records office. Stay there, I'll come get you, sorry. I don't think we have time for that, Seshel said. What are you talking about? You know those big vats? They use trivium generators to melt the metal. Shutting down the power grid destabilized the reactor cores. How long before they blow? Not long enough to keep discussing it. Scourge took the hint, forcing his weary legs into a run. He raced across the pitch-black manufacturing floor. His broken ribs made it almost impossible to catch his breath, and his thighs and calves were on fire. He caught up to Seshel halfway down the maintenance corridor they had used to enter the building. He didn't say anything as he ran, conserving what little breath he had for a final push to get clear of the blast radius. He burst through the maintenance door and into the cool night air, Seshel only a few steps behind him. Jumping the security fence wasn't an option in his current state, so he headed for the gate he'd unlocked for Seshel at the start of the mission. He was slowing down, the weight of his armor sapping the last of his strength. He drew on the force to give himself a last burst of speed. Seshel caught up with him a few steps before the gate. The blast wave caught them an instant later. Fortunately, most of the explosion was contained within the plant, preventing them from being pulverized by the concussive force, and as it was, they were swept off their feet and sent tumbling through the security gate by a wall of air, sound, and shards of glass. Scourge hit the ground, rolled onto his stomach, and instinctively covered the back of his head as debris rained down around them. He lay there for about 30 seconds, dazed, ears still ringing. He forced himself to his feet, triggering a coughing fit. The broken ribs made it feel like his chest was being stabbed as he hacked up blood-flecked phlegm. The back of his head and neck were also bleeding. Flying glass had cut him in at least a dozen places, though his armor had shielded most of his body. Confident that none of his injuries were life-threatening, he turned his attention to his companion. Seshel lay face down on the ground beside him, not moving. He hadn't been wearing any armor, and his back was a bloody mess. Though the glass shards had shredded his clothes and the flesh beneath, all the wounds looked superficial. Scourge prodded him with his foot until he finally responded with a groan. "Get up," Scourge wheezed. "I'm too weak to carry you." Seshel did as ordered, and the pair of them limped back through the forest toward their waiting shuttle. Behind them, the UDM plant burned. And that is the end of that chapter. The next one is fairly short, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. This is chapter 5. I believe this one's only like 4 or 5 pages. Six pages. So, Revan rarely visited the Jedi Temple on Coruscant anymore. Though technically still a member of the Order, he couldn't help but feel like an intruder as he mounted the steps and passed between the twin rows of statues that stood guard at the entrance. Many Jedi, particularly the Padawans and younger Jedi Knights, considered him a hero, a living legend, but the more conservative masters held a very different view. Some resented him for leading thousands of Jedi to their deaths in the war against the Mandalorians. Others could not forgive him for the millions of Republic soldiers and citizens killed when he and Malak returned from the unknown regions as conquerors. Officially, he had been redeemed and returned to the light, but there were those who still felt he bore the indelible corruption of the dark side. To be fair, Revan had done little to try to convince them otherwise. At the top of the stairs, he passed through the temple entrance, crossing the long marble floor as he made his way to the interior courtyard. The council had offered to find a suitable master to retain him in the proper ways of the Jedi, an offer he had flatly refused. Revan had learned too much about the Force, both the light side and the dark, to take instruction like some common Padawan. His contrariness might have been overlooked had Bastila not chosen a similar path. At one time, she had been the Order's bright young star, but Malak had temporarily turned her to the dark side, and the Council believed that she also needed to be retrained. When she refused, some of them saw a familiar pattern: Revan leading a promised young Jedi away from the accepted teachings of the Order. Their marriage further exacerbated their situation. The Jedi Order opposed emotional attachments, believing they were a stepping stone to destruction. They taught that love begat jealousy, which led to the dark side, but Revan had seen its redemptive powers firsthand. It was his love that had brought Bastila back to the light. Their emotional bond had wrought salvation for both of them. Denying or attempting to utterly control emotion, Revan felt, was a fool's game. Jealousy was actually the result of ill-prepared Jedi being overwhelmed by feelings they had never learned to face. Revan believed Jedi should be taught to use positive emotions like love and happiness to strengthen their connection to the Force in the same way that hatred and anger gave power to those who followed the dark side. Emerging from the entrance hall, Revan was struck, as always, by the magnificent view. The Jedi Temple, had been built atop a massive mountain, its rooftop converted into a huge open-air courtyard that overlooked Coruscant's endless cityscape a full kilometer below. A towering spire had been built in each of the courtyard's corners, and a fifth spire, larger than the others, rose up from the center. Small clusters of robed figures, a mixture of Jedi Padawans, knights, and masters, I almost said monsters, masters, filled the area. Some made their way quickly through the garden paths on business. Others lounged on benches or by fountains, taking a break from chores or training exercises. Revan kept the brown hood of his traditional Jedi cloak up to avoid being recognized. He wanted to conduct his business and be on his way as quickly as possible. The sooner he left the temple, the better. He hadn't always felt this way. In the first few weeks after Malak's defeat, when he was still being honored and feted as the savior of the galaxy, he had approached the Council with an offer to share his new understanding of the Force with the other members of the Order. He had expected some resistance, of course. The Council was stuck in the old ways. They didn't understand that the Force was alive. They couldn't accept that it had evolved beyond their staid teachings. Yet he had been unprepared for the sheer hostility of the Council's reaction. Not only did they reject his offer, but a handful of counselors had wanted to banish him from the Order. Fortunately, cooler heads had prevailed. Revan was a hero. The tale of his redemption and return to the light had spread throughout the galaxy, though the sordid details of how the Jedi had stripped away his identity had been carefully excised. The wiser members of the Council understood that the legend of Revan was far too valuable to throw away simply because they no longer had any use for the man himself. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Jedi could not speak out against his marriage to Bastila. Officially, both would still be recognized as Jedi in good standing, with all corresponding rights and privileges. In exchange, Revan promised not to spread his heresy to other members of the Order. At first, Bastila wanted to reject their terms, but Revan convinced her that an ideological war with the Jedi Council served no purpose. They had done their part. It was time for them to fade from history and live out the rest of their lives in peace. And so they had, until Revan started having those blasted dreams. That was why he was there now. Canderous was out among his own people, seeing if he could find some connection between the war and a planet shrouded in the darkness of eternal storms. He'd been gone several weeks, and Revan had yet to hear back. But rather than sit around and do nothing, he decided to do a little investigation of his own. Moving with long, quick strides, he made his way to the spire on the northwest corner of the courtyard. This tower was home to the Council of First Knowledge, a collection of 5 Jedi Masters and their underlings who specialized in the history and lore of the entire Order. It was also home to the Temple Archives, by far the galaxy's largest assembled collection of documents, data disks, and holocrons. It was often said that if an item did not appear in the archive records, then it did not exist. That sounds familiar. Camino. Despite the bold claim, Revan doubted he'd find anything to explain his dreams lurking in the stacks. He'd actually come here in search of something else. Someone else. A name from his past. Massive chunks of his memory were still missing. To fill in the gaps, he'd need to speak to someone who'd been with him during that time. Someone who had served beside him in the war. Malak had been his right hand during the campaign against the Mandalorians, but Malak was dead. Revan would get no answers there. Yet there had been another, a powerful Jedi named Mitra Surik. Mitra had been among the first to join Revan's cause, and she quickly proved herself to be a brilliant tactician and military leader. Recognizing her potential, Revan had made her a general, giving her control over nearly half of the Republic and Jedi troops under his command. Mitra had been instrumental in defeating the Mandalorians, dealing them a devastating blow during the Battle of Malachor V, though at a cost nearly impossible to fathom. He hesitated only briefly at the door leading into the spire, steeling himself for what he might find. Then he entered the building and mounted the long spiral staircase leading up to the first floor of the archives. Revan had defeated Mandalore shortly after Mitra's victory at Malachor V, effectively ending the war. Then he and Malak had set off into the unknown regions, while Mitra had returned to face the judgment of the Jedi Council. She hadn't spoken to Revan since. He didn't even know where she was. He knew some of the details of what had happened. On her return, the Jedi Council had declared her a traitor for following Revan. They had stripped her of her rank and banished her for branding her as the Exile. According to the rumors, she had left Republic space and simply disappeared. Yet Revan felt there was more to the story. Mitra hadn't tried to contact him following Malak's defeat. Even if she had left Republic space, she surely would have heard of Revan's redemption by now. The fact there had been no word from her was disturbing. Once he had tried to reach out to her with the Force. Serving in battle with someone formed a special bond. Even across the breadth of the galaxy, he should have been able to get some vague sense of her presence. Yet he felt nothing. The simplest explanation was that she had become one with the Force, but Revan couldn't allow himself to believe she was dead. After surviving the horrors of Malachor V, an anonymous death in the Outer Rim simply didn't seem fair. He stepped from the spiral staircase and onto the 4th-story landing, then pushed open the door to the 2nd floor of the archives. 4th-story landing, 2nd floor. That's confusing. He was relieved to see there was nobody else around. He wanted to do his research in private. Passing through the tightly packed stacks of data disks, he took a seat at one of the holo terminals. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, so he simply entered Mitra's name into the index. Several entries came up, including an official report on Malachor V compiled by one of the Jedi archivists. He made a mental note of the reference number, retrieved the data disk from its shelf, and inserted it into the terminal. He spent the next few minutes reviewing the report, but failed to come across anything he didn't already know. Malachor V had been a trap, a ploy to lure the Mandalorian fleet in close enough to the planet to unleash the mass shadow generator, an experimental superweapon that would draw upon the gravitational anomalies unique to the Malachor system to instantaneously destroy every ship orbiting the planet. Revan split his fleet in two, giving command of one half to Mitra, while he led his forces against Mandalore's flagship. He ordered his most trusted general to use her fleet as bait to lure the bulk of the Mandalorian ships within range of the mass shadow generator. The Mandalorians had taken the bait, and once they were in range, Mitra gave the order to engage the mass shadow generator. The atmosphere exploded in a flash of fire, leaving only ash behind. Everything on Malakor's surface, every plant and tree, every animal and insect, was instantly vaporized by the intense heat. The ground cracked and heaved, leaving deep scars across the blasted landscape. At the same time, hundreds of ships, Republic and Mandalorian alike, were yanked from orbit by the creation of an irresistible gravity vortex at the planet's core. They crashed into the surface of the world, striking with such velocity that their hulls actually penetrated several kilometers into the ground, burying the twisted wreckage and broken bodies. Tens of thousands of lives were snuffed out in a fraction of a second. Revan's and Mitra's ships had both been safely beyond the range of the superweapon, though whether that was by luck or design, Revan honestly couldn't say. His memories of that time were gone, and looking back on his actions, he couldn't fully explain or justify them. Had he known what was going to happen, willingly sacrificing thousands of his own followers to achieve ultimate victory over the Mandalorians? Or had something in the plan gone horribly wrong? The report wasn't so ambiguous. It claimed Revan and Mitra both knew what would happen. It declared them criminals of war and mass murderers. The author of the report speculated that Malachor V was proof that even then Revan had already embraced the ways of the dark side. But Revan wasn't interested in the opinions of some anonymous Jedi archivist. He only cared for the facts, particularly what happened to Mitra after the battle, and here the report was severely lacking. All he could glean was that she had returned to her own free will to face the Council, which summarily banished her from the Jedi Order and Republic space. "I should have guessed it was you." The voice came from behind, sharp with indignation. Revan rose from his chair and turned to face the speaker. She wore the traditional robes of a Jedi archivist, though Revan knew she was in fact a Jedi Master. She was young for the position, about Bastila's age, but her hair was platinum white. She had cold blue eyes and a pale complexion that spoke of a life spent inside the archives, well sheltered from the rays of the sun. "Atris," Revan said, with a nod and a forced smile, silently cursing. Once a close friend of Mitra's, Atris had refused to join those who had gone to battle the Mandalorians. A staunch traditionalist, she had shared the unfavorable opinion of Revan common to the older, more conservative masters. Of all the people who could have interrupted his search, he could think of few he wanted to encounter less. "Still trying to recapture your lost memories?" she asked, a little too smugly, and Revan understood that her arrival was no accident. Atris must have tagged the report he'd been reading so it would alert her whenever it was referenced. There were no rules or regulations against this kind of security feature, but it was rarely done. As a rule, those who served the Council of First Knowledge respected the right to personal privacy of Jedi visiting the Temple archives. Yet, even though Revan had sought to keep his investigations private, he had done nothing wrong, and he still needed answers. "This report seems to skim over some of the relevant details," he said. "Shoddy work," he added on a sudden hunch. He saw Atris bristle, and he knew he'd guessed right. Not only had she tagged the report, she'd also prepared it. "Maybe you just can't see the obvious truth in front of you," she snapped. Revan smiled. Despite all the Jedi teachings about peace and serenity, he'd always had a knack for riling up overly sanctimonious members of the Order like Atris. "Guess I just need your great wisdom to help me understand what I'm missing. What makes you think I would do anything to help you? I'm still a Jedi, and Mitra's sentence is a matter of record," he reminded her, suddenly serious. "I have a right to know the truth of what happened. All of it. What more is there to tell? She made the mistake of following you. You led her down the path to the dark side. She committed an unforgivable act, and for this the Council banished her." It was a desperate act during a desperate time, Revan said, and the mass shadow generator was an experimental prototype. How could the council be sure Mitra even knew what would happen? What if it was all a mistake, a terrible accident? The mass shadow generator was a weapon of war, Atris replied with a cool, rational calm. Its sole purpose was death and destruction, and she gave the order to activate it. How is that an accident? But she obviously regretted her actions, and she surrendered voluntarily to the council. Why wouldn't they show her mercy? They needed to make an example of her. Atris made no effort to hide the bitterness in her voice. She became a symbol for all those who had defied the will of the council. Mercy was not an option. It can't be that simple, Revan pressed. My crimes were far worse, yet the council gave me a second chance. You could still be of use to us. Revan sensed there was something she wasn't saying. What does that mean? Mitra was a powerful Jedi. Why didn't the council try to redeem her? The archivist shook her head in disbelief. You really have no idea what you did to her, do you? No, I don't, Revan snapped, allowing his frustration to bubble over. My memory has more holes in it than a Kaminoan sponge, so why don't you just tell me? Atris bit her lower lip and glared at him. Then, perhaps realizing that answering his questions was the quickest way to get him to leave, she began to speak. Mitra was much closer to the mass shadow generator than you were. She felt the shockwave. It nearly killed her, left her vulnerable. At the same time, she felt the deaths of the Mandalorians and her fellow soldiers through the Force. It was all too much to bear in her weakened state. It would have killed her. She paused for emphasis before continuing. Instinctively, she protected herself the only way she knew how. She cut herself off from the Force, permanently. I'm sorry, Revan said sincerely. I had no idea. Really? Atris replied angrily. Then why did you and Malak leave her behind when you went into the unknown regions? You realized she was of no further use to you, and you abandoned her. That's why she came back to the Order to face judgment. I didn't see that in your report. Is that fact or just speculation? Her refusal to speak was reply enough. Even if what you say is true, Revan continued, I'm not the same man anymore. Is it right to still hold me accountable for those crimes? A Chalarax can't change its spots, she muttered under her breath. Revan was too busy trying to process all he had learned to react to her comment. If Mitra was cut off from the Force, that would explain why he hadn't been able to sense her presence. That meant she could still be alive somewhere. She might still know something that could help him understand the meaning of his vision. Do you know where she went? He asked. I need to speak with her. Haven't you done enough already? Atris demanded. It's your fault she defied the council and betrayed the Order. It's your fault she fell to the dark side and was branded the exile. It's your fault she cut herself off from the Force. For a Jedi, that's a fate worse than death. I've come closer to death than most, Revan countered, and I can assure you that's not true. Atris snorted in contempt. That is the difference between us. I live for the Force, you live for yourself. Revan shrugged, knowing a philosophical argument wasn't going to get him any closer to finding Mitra. Whatever you think of me, he said, I did not compel Mitra into any of this. She made her own choices, and it should be her decision now if she wants to speak to me again, not yours. If you know where she is, you have to tell me. I haven't spoken to her since her trial, Atris answered through gritted teeth, and Revan knew she was telling the truth. I do not know where she went, and I hope I never see her again. The exile betrayed the Order, as did you. You're not welcome here. Go back to your wife. Atris spoke the last word with such venom she nearly choked on it. Revan said, wagging his finger at her. There is no emotion, there is peace. Her lip curled up in a snarl, and she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room. Revan waited until the sound of her feet on the stairs faded, then sat slowly back down in a chair. With Atris gone, he could let his sarcastic mask slip. Despite what he'd said to her, he couldn't help but feel responsible for Mitra. He'd refused to give Atris the satisfaction of seeing his guilt and grief, but now that he was alone, the emotions came flooding to the surface. Most of his specific memories of Mitra were gone. He could recall only disjointed bits and pieces, but she had once been one of his closest friends, and he still felt a powerful emotional connection to her. Slumping forward, he buried his face in his hands. He expected tears to follow, but that didn't happen. Instead, he just felt a hollow, numbing sorrow. After several minutes, he took a deep breath and collected himself and rose to his feet. Then he headed out the archive door and down the stairs. He'd come to the temple in search of an old friend and confidant, hoping she could help him understand the dreams that plagued his nights. Instead, he'd found a dead end and learned the grim truth about the one they called the Exile. No wonder I never come here anymore, he mumbled under his breath as he made his way across the courtyard and headed for the exit. And that is the end of chapter 5. So, we will call it there and pick it up on Wednesday. I'm going to finish Revan before I do any more short stories to kind of keep them close to each other in the timeline, so we don't get the short stories way out of whack. So that is where we'll leave off, and yeah, I will see you all in the next stream. It is Monday. Yeah, I'll see you in the next stream. I'm not sure if I'll game or not. Probably I will. Kind of feeling like it tonight.
My heart is beating. I know the pieces. One is broken, one is beat. Because I have seen apart. I have known about the body. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart. Don't take. If you leave it behind, someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You left me all sorry. Was my love? Was it love? You had no answers.